Imagine losing your childhood at 8 years old and never getting it back. Rin had lived 16 years in chains, her spirit crushed but never broken when fate walked into her village wearing a king's face. At 24, she knew only obedience and pain. Alpha King Kaelen, 42 and weary from his recent coronation, was touring his realm in secret when he found her chained in the rain. What he saw wasn't just another broken slave. It was fire burning in eyes that refused to surrender. In one shocking moment, he freed her and declared her his Luna before the entire court. The kingdom exploded in outrage. A slave becoming queen overnight was unthinkable. But what nobody understood was the price they would both pay for his bold decision. What happens when enemies lurk in every shadow of the palace? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The memory never faded, not even after 16 years. 8-year-old Rin had been picking wildflowers in the meadow behind her parents' cottage when the raiders came. She remembered the way the sun filtered through the oak leaves that morning, how the dew made her bare feet slip on the grass, and the sound of her mother humming while hanging laundry on the line. Then came the screams. Black-cloaked riders swept through the village like a plague of locusts, torches blazing, swords singing their deadly song. Rin dropped her flowers and ran toward the cottage, but strong arms caught her before she could reach the door. The last thing she saw of her childhood home was smoke rising from the thatched roof, her mother's white sheets now stained with ash and blood. "This one's young enough to train properly," the man holding her had said, his voice rough as gravel. "House Blackthorn pays well for moldable stock." The journey to the Blackthorn estate passed in a blur of tears and terror. Rin was crammed into a wagon with other children, all of them too shocked to speak, too frightened to comfort each other. The wooden boards beneath them were already worn smooth by countless other small bodies that had made this same hopeless journey. Lord Aldrich Blackthorn was a man who collected suffering like other nobles collected fine wines. Tall and gaunt, with silver hair that gleamed like polished steel, he moved through his manor with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. His wife, Lady Miriam, possessed a beauty that had long since curdled into cruelty. Her smile was a blade hidden beneath silk, her touch a promise of pain disguised as gentleness. They renamed her simply Girl. Her real name, Rin, became something she whispered to herself in the darkness, a secret rebellion they could never quite steal from her. The servant quarters occupied the manor's lowest level, a maze of narrow corridors and cramped rooms that never saw sunlight. The walls wept moisture in winter and baked the air stale in summer. Rin learned to move like a shadow through these halls, to speak only when spoken to keep her eyes downcast and her thoughts hidden. Her days began before dawn with the ringing of the servant bell, scrubbing floors until her knees bled, hauling water from the well until her shoulders ached, serving meals to nobles who looked through her as if she were made of air. The work was endless, the punishment swift and brutal for any perceived failure, but they could not break her completely. In stolen moments, when the house slept and the moon cast silver light through the barred windows, Rin would touch the small locket hidden beneath her rough servant's dress. Inside was a tiny portrait of her parents, painted by a traveling artist just weeks before the raid. Her mother's gentle smile, her father's kind eyes, these became her anchor in the storm of her new life. She learned to find strength in small rebellions. An extra crumb of bread shared with a younger servant, a flower placed on the windowsill of the sick room, a whispered word of comfort to a child crying themselves to sleep. These acts of kindness became her defiance, proof that some part of her remained unbroken. Meanwhile, in the gleaming capital city of Lunaris, a different kind of burden weighed upon another soul. Kaelen Moonshadow had never wanted to be king. The crown had come to him through tragedy, his older brother's death in battle, his father's heart giving out from grief shortly after. At 42, he was older than most new rulers, weathered by years of serving as his brother's general and his father's advisor. The throne room of Castle Lunaris was a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship. Moonstone columns reached toward a vaulted ceiling, painted with the phases of the moon, while silver inlays in the marble floors traced the constellation patterns sacred to their people. Here, surrounded by centuries of werewolf history, Kaelen felt more alone than ever. The crown was heavy, not just the physical weight of gold and gems, but the responsibility it represented. Every decision rippled outward to affect thousands of lives. Every mistake could mean the difference between prosperity and suffering for his people. The burden had aged him, carved new lines around his dark eyes and threaded silver through his black hair. His advisors spoke of marriage, of the need for an heir to secure the royal line. They presented him with portraits of suitable noble daughters, each one beautiful, educated, and politically advantageous. But Kaelen had seen enough political marriages in his lifetime, had watched too many unions built on duty rather than affection grumble under the weight of their own emptiness. A king must marry for the good of the realm, his chief advisor, Chancellor Aldwin, reminded him almost daily. The old man's white beard waggled with emphasis as he spoke. Personal feelings are a luxury you cannot afford, Your Majesty. But Kaelen had spent too many years watching his parents' loveless marriage to believe that duty alone could sustain a union. His mother had died bitter and cold, his father distant and rigid. He would not repeat their mistakes, crown or no crown. Reports of corruption in the outer provinces gave him an excuse to leave the capital, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of court politics and marriage negotiations. Dressed as a minor lord on routine business, he set out to see his kingdom as it truly was, not through the filtered lens of official reports and diplomatic niceties. The contrast between the capital's gleaming spires and the struggling villages beyond its walls struck him like a physical blow. Here, the weight of noble privilege pressed down on common folk like stones upon wildflowers. He saw families torn apart by debt, children working in conditions that would have sparked riots if they had occurred within the city walls, and servants treated as property rather than people. It was corruption of the worst kind, not the simple theft of gold, but the theft of human dignity. And nowhere was it more evident than in the outer reaches of Lord Blackthorn's domain. The village of Thornwick crouched beside the Blackthorn Manor like a beggar at a nobleman's table, surviving on scraps and suffering. The houses were little, more than hovels, their thatched roofs patched with whatever materials the residents could scavenge. The people moved with the careful, beaten-down manner of those who had learned that drawing attention meant inviting trouble. Kaelen's escort, a small guard unit disguised as merchants, made camp on the village outskirts while he conducted his investigation. What he found made his blood run cold. Forced labor that was slavery in all but name. Taxes so high they amounted to theft. Children sold to pay impossible debts. And overseeing it all, Lord Blackthorn collected his profits with the casual indifference of a man harvesting wheat. The breaking point came on his third evening in Thornwick. Rain fell in sheets that turned the manor's courtyard into a muddy lake, and lightning split the sky with violent white scars. Kaelen had been preparing to confront Lord Blackthorn directly when he saw her. She was chained to a post in the courtyard, soaked to the skin and shivering. Her servant's dress clung to her thin frame, and her dark hair hung in wet tangles around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, not broken, despite everything that had been done to her. In those depths, he saw a flame that all the cruelty in the world had failed to extinguish. This was no ordinary punishment. This was a statement, a reminder to every other servant of their place in Lord Blackthorn's hierarchy. The girl, she couldn't be more than 24, had been left exposed to the elements for some perceived defiance, and Kaelen felt rage building in his chest like molten steel. He had seen enough. The investigation was over. Now came justice. The Storm had been raging for 3 days, and Rin had been chained in the courtyard for 2 of them. Her crime had been simple. She had stepped between Lady Miriam's riding crop and a 10-year-old kitchen boy who had dropped a tray of sweetmeats. The child's tears had moved her more than her own safety, and she had acted without thinking. "How dare you interfere with discipline?" Lady Miriam had hissed, her pale eyes glittering with malice. "Perhaps sometime in the elements will remind you of your place." Now Rin knelt in the mud, her wrists raw from the iron shackles, her servants' dress offering no protection against the driving rain. She had long since stopped shivering, a dangerous sign that she recognized but was powerless to fight. Her lips had taken on a blue tinge, and her thoughts moved like honey in winter, slow and thick, but she was alive. She was still herself. That had to count for something. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up through the curtain of her soaked hair. A figure moved across the courtyard with purpose, his dark cloak billowing behind him like wings. At first, she thought it might be Lord Blackthorne come to gloat, but something about the man's bearing was different. He moved with authority, yes, but also with controlled fury that made the air around him seem to crackle with dangerous energy. Kaelen reached the chained girl and dropped to one knee in the mud beside her, heedless of his fine clothes. Up close, he could see the delicate bone structure beneath her hollow cheeks, the way her hands trembled not just from cold, but from exhaustion. This close, he could also see the faint scars that marked her arms, old wounds, carefully hidden, evidence of years of systematic abuse. "Look at me," he said softly, his voice cutting through the sound of rain on stone. Rin raised her eyes, expecting to see another tormentor. Instead, she found herself gazing into dark eyes filled with something she had almost forgotten existed: compassion. The man studying her face had strong features weathered by sun and wind, and there was something about him that spoke of authority earned rather than inherited. "What is your name?" he asked. "Girl," she whispered automatically, the response beaten into her over 16 years. His jaw tightened. "Your real name?" The simple question hit her like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had asked her that? When was the last time it had mattered? "Rin," she breathed, the word feeling foreign on her lips after so many years of silence. "Rin." He spoke it like a benediction, giving weight and dignity to the name she had almost forgotten belonged to her. "I'm going to get you out of these chains." She wanted to tell him that he couldn't, that Lord Blackthorne's wrath would fall on anyone who interfered. But before she could speak, he was already examining the shackles with the practiced eye of someone who understood both metalwork and strategy. The royal seal ring on his finger caught the lightning's flash, and Rin's breath caught in her throat. She had seen that symbol before, embroidered on banners and carved into monuments, the ancient wolf crest of the royal house. This was no minor lord or traveling merchant. "You're the king," she whispered. "I am," Kaelen confirmed, his attention still focused on her bonds. "And you are under my protection now." The shackles were well made, but not magical. A few precise strikes with the pommel of his concealed dagger, and the lock mechanism gave way with a sharp click. The iron cuffs fell away from Rin's wrists, leaving angry red marks that would become scars to match the others. As the metal hit the ground, Rin felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening, like the first breath after nearly drowning. She was free. After 16 years of captivity, after countless days and nights when she had wondered if death might be preferable to this existence, she was actually free. "Can you stand?" Kaelen asked, offering her his hand. Rin tried to rise but found her. Legs wouldn't support her weight. The combination of cold, exhaustion, and the psychological shock of sudden freedom had left her weak as a newborn colt. Without hesitation, Kaelen scooped her into his arms, cradling her against his chest with surprising gentleness for such a large man. The warmth of human contact, kind human contact, was almost overwhelming. Rin had gone so long without touch. that wasn't accompanied by pain, that she had forgotten how comforting it could be. She found herself relaxing into his embrace, despite every instinct screaming that this was impossible, that good things didn't happen to girls like her. "What do you think you're doing?" Lord Blackthorn's voice cracked across the courtyard like a whip. He emerged from the manor's main entrance, flanked by two of his guards, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the storm, his expensive robes protected by a magical barrier that repelled the rain. Behind him came Lady Miriam, her beautiful face twisted with outrage. "That is my property you're holding," Lord Blackthorn continued, his pale eyes fixed on Rin with possessive fury. "Release her immediately." Kaelen turned slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries of royal bloodline. "Property?" he repeated, the single word dripping with dangerous quiet. "Did you just refer to a free citizen of this realm as property?" Lord Blackthorn's expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. Something about the strangers. Bearing the way he held himself, the unconscious arrogance that came only from absolute authority, it was setting off warning bells in the nobleman's mind. "She is a servant bound by legal contract," Lord Blackthorn said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Her terms of service, show me this contract." The words weren't a request, but a command that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the courtyard. Lord Blackthorn's mouth opened and closed like a fish struggling for air, because, of course, there was no contract. There never had been. Rin was a slave in all but name, kept in bondage through violence and fear rather than legal documentation. The papers are not immediately available," Lord Blackthorn stammered. "Because they don't exist," Kaelen said flatly. "Because you are holding this woman, and how many others, in illegal bondage. Because you have built your wealth on human suffering and called it business." Lady Miriam stepped forward, her beauty mask slipping to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "Who are you to question the rights of noble houses?" she demanded. "By what authority do you interfere in our affairs?" In response, Kaelen shifted Rin carefully to one arm and extended his right hand, displaying the royal seal ring where lightning caught the ancient wolf crest and made it seem to leap with life. The symbol needed no explanation. Every citizen of the realm would recognize it on sight. The effect was instantaneous. Lord Blackthorn's face went white as parchment, and he dropped to one knee so quickly that his expensive robes splashed in the muddy water. Lady Miriam followed suit, but not before Rin caught the flash of pure hatred that crossed her features. "Your Majesty," Lord Blackthorn gasped, his voice shaking. "Forgive me, I had no idea." "Rise," Kaelen commanded, his tone cold as winter steel. "Both of you." They obeyed, but neither dared meet his eyes. The guards had also dropped to their knees, understanding now that they faced not just their king, but a very angry king who had caught them in the middle of systematic abuse. "Under the Crown's authority," Kaelen continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard despite the storm, "I hereby dissolve any and all claim bonds of servitude between this household and the woman known as Rin. She is a free citizen under the Crown's protection." "Of course, Your Majesty," Lord Blackthorn said quickly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold rain. "If there was any misunderstanding about her status—" "There was no misunderstanding," Kaelen cut him off. "There was only cruelty masquerading as law." He looked down at Rin, who was staring up at him with wonder and disbelief warring in her dark eyes. In that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or destiny finally revealing itself. Whatever it was, it sealed both their fates. "Furthermore," Kaelen said, his voice carrying a note of finality that made the very air seem to still, "I claim this woman as my Luna, my chosen mate and queen. She is under my personal protection, and any who would harm her harm the Crown itself." The declaration hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Lady Miriam swayed on her feet as if she might faint, while Lord Blackthorn's jaw worked soundlessly. The guards exchanged shocked glances, understanding that they had just witnessed history being made, and Rin, cradled in the king's arms with rain washing the tears from her face, felt the last chains around her heart finally break free. The journey to Castle Lunaris passed in a haze of disbelief for Rin. She rode in the king's own carriage, wrapped in furs that cost more than most families saw in a lifetime, but she couldn't quite believe it was real. Every mile that carried her away from the Blackthorn estate felt like waking from a nightmare, but the dream that replaced it seemed too fantastic to trust. Kaelen rode alongside the carriage for much of the journey, close enough that she could see him through the window. He had changed from his travel clothes into the deep blue and silver of the royal house, and the transformation was striking. This was no longer the compassionate stranger who had freed her from chains. This was the Alpha King of the Northern realm, and the weight of that reality pressed down on Rin like a physical force. What had he done? What had she allowed him to do? The question tormented her as the landscape rolled past, forests giving way to farmland, farmland to villages, villages to the sprawling outer districts of the capital city. With every passing hour, the magnitude of Kaelen's impulsive declaration became clearer. He had claimed her as his Luna, his queen, in front of witnesses. There would be no taking it back, no quiet dissolution of an inconvenient promise. Castle Lunaris rose from the heart of the capital like a dream carved from moonstone and silver. Its towers reached toward the sky with elegant grace, and banners bearing the royal wolf crest snapped proudly in the mountain wind. But for all its beauty, it looked to Rin like the most beautiful prison in the world. The carriage rolled through the main gates, and suddenly they were surrounded by people. Palace guards in gleaming armor, servants in livery finer than anything Rin had ever owned, nobles who had come to catch their first glimpse of the king's shocking choice. Their stares felt like physical weight pressing against the carriage windows. "They're all looking at me," Rin whispered, shrinking back into the furs. "They're curious," Kaelen said, having dismounted and opened the carriage door himself rather than waiting for a servant. "It will pass." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Rin could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the crowd with the wariness of a soldier expecting attack. He had brought her here, but he wasn't naive about the challenges that lay ahead. The Luna's crown waited for her in the Queen's chambers, a circlet of ancient silver embedded with moonstones that seemed to glow with their own inner light. It had been worn by generations of royal consorts, each one chosen for political advantage, family connections, or strategic alliances. None had been slaves elevated to the throne in a single dramatic gesture. "It's beautiful," Rin said softly, touching the moonstone centerpiece with one trembling finger. "It's yours by right now," replied Elena, the head of the Queen's household. She was a woman of middle years with kind eyes and graying hair, but Rin could sense the uncertainty beneath her professional courtesy. "Though perhaps we should begin with simpler jewelry until you're more comfortable." The suggestion was tactful but clear. Rin wasn't ready for the crown, might never be ready for it. The woman who had spent 16 years scrubbing floors and hauling water was supposed to transform overnight into a queen worthy of moonstone and silver. The Queen's chambers were a study in elegant luxury. Tapestries depicted the history of the royal line in threads of gold and silver, while furniture carved from rare woods gleamed under crystal chandeliers. The bed alone was larger than the entire room Rin had shared with 3 other servants at the Blackthorn estate, but it was the mirrors that truly unnerved her. They were everywhere, polished silver surfaces that reflected her image back from every angle. For years, she had avoided her own reflection, had trained herself not to look too closely at the girl in the glass. Mirrors in servants' quarters were small and cheap when they existed at all, and she had grown used to existing without truly seeing herself. Now she had no choice. Everywhere she looked, a stranger stared back, hollow-cheeked and thin, marked by scars both visible and hidden, dressed in fine clothes that seemed to mock her with their beauty. This woman in the mirror couldn't possibly be a queen. This woman looked like exactly what she was, a broken slave playing dress-up in her betters' clothes. "Your Majesty?" Elena's voice held gentle concern. "Are you feeling unwell?" The title struck Rin like a physical blow. "Your Majesty," as if she deserved such a dress, as if she were worthy of the respect it implied. She wanted to laugh or cry or run, but instead she just stood there, staring at her reflection and wondering how long it would take for everyone to realize the enormous mistake that had been made. "I don't know how to be a queen," she whispered. "Few do when they begin," Elena said kindly. "It is learned like any other skill. His Majesty has arranged for tutors, etiquette, history, languages, statecraft, everything you'll need to know." But Rin wasn't thinking about lessons in deportment or political theory. She was thinking about the way her hands shook when she tried to hold a teacup properly, how her voice died in her throat when servants addressed her as "Your Majesty," how every instinct screamed at her to kneel and beg forgiveness for the presumption of sitting in a chair meant for royalty. The worst part was the kindness. The palace staff were professional and courteous, but she could see the questions in their eyes, the carefully hidden doubt. They were too well trained to openly challenge their king's choice, but their skepticism was a living thing that followed her through every corridor. Some were more obvious about it than others. Lady Catherine, the Queen Dowager's former lady-in-waiting, had made her position clear from the moment of introduction. "I served the previous queen for 30 years, she had said, her voice arctic with disapproval. "I understand the unique circumstances of your elevation, but I hope you appreciate the dignity required of your new position." The message was unmistakable. Don't embarrass the crown with your common origins. Remember your place, even if that place was now supposed to be above everyone else's. That night, alone in chambers that felt more like a beautiful cage than a home, Rin touched the small locket she still wore beneath her fine nightgown. Her parents' faces smiled up at her from the tiny portrait, and she wondered what they would think of their daughter's impossible rise. Would they be proud? Would they understand the price that came with such unexpected fortune? Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that mixed her old nightmares with new anxieties. In them, she stood before crowds of nobles who laughed at her pretensions to royalty, while Kaelen watched with disappointment growing in his dark eyes. She woke more than once in a cold sweat, certain that she would find herself back in the servants' quarters, that the past few days had been nothing but a cruel fantasy. But the morning sun, streaming through crystal windows, proved it real. The luxury, the responsibility, and the growing certainty that she was drowning in water too deep for someone who had never learned to swim. The communication crystal arrived on her third morning at the palace, delivered by a young mage whose nervous energy reminded Rin uncomfortably of her own anxiety. The stone was roughly the size of her palm, translucent blue, shot through with veins of silver that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. "His Majesty thought this might help," the mage explained, his voice carefully neutral. "It allows you to practice speaking your thoughts without fear of judgment. The stone absorbs words and intentions, but shares them with no one." Rin accepted the crystal with hands that trembled slightly. Even Kaelen's gifts carried the weight of expectation. He was trying to help, but his help only emphasized how much help she needed. Still, when she was alone with the crystal that evening, she found herself speaking to it in ways she had never spoken aloud. "I don't belong here," she whispered to the glowing stone. "Everyone knows it. They're too polite to say it directly, but I can see it in their eyes. The serving girl who forgot her place." The crystal pulsed with gentle warmth, absorbing her words without judgment, and slowly Rin began to understand its gift. For the first time in her adult life, she could speak freely without consequences, could voice thoughts that had been locked in silence for years. "I'm angry," she admitted to the stone, the words coming easier now. "Angry at what was stolen from me. Angry at the years I lost. Angry that I'm grateful for scraps of kindness when I should have had basic human dignity all along." The crystal's glow intensified, and she felt something loosening in her chest, the tight knot of suppressed emotion that had kept her sane through 16 years of abuse, but now threatened to strangle her new life before it could truly begin. Palace life moved according to rhythms as complex and formal as any dance. Breakfast was served at precisely 8 o'clock, in the smaller dining room, where Rin sat at a table that could have comfortably seated 20. The silverware alone represented more wealth than entire villages saw in a year, and she found herself staring at the array of forks and knives, trying to remember which Eleanor had said to use first. Kaelen joined her when his schedule allowed, but their conversations were stilted affairs, interrupted by servants and advisors who seemed to materialize from thin air whenever sensitive topics arose. They spoke of safe things, the weather, the palace gardens, her lessons, while deeper currents of understanding remained unexplored. "The etiquette instructor seems pleased with your progress," Kaelen said one morning, cutting his eggs with precise movements that spoke of a lifetime's practice. "Lady Vesper is very patient," Rin replied carefully, though privately she wondered if patience was just another word for resigned despair. Her lessons were a series of small humiliations disguised as education. How to walk without looking like a servant trying not to draw attention. How to speak without betraying her common origins. How to eat without revealing that she had spent years grabbing whatever food was available before it could be taken away. "She tells me you have natural grace," Kaelen continued, and Rin caught something in his tone that might have been pride or might have been desperate hope. "She's very kind," Rin said, which was true enough. Lady Vesper never showed impatience directly, but Rin had learned to read the subtle signs of frustration in her instructors' faces. The palace intrigue swirled around her like invisible currents, most of it passing over her head, but some of it impossible to miss. She caught fragments of conversation in hallways, whispers that cut off abruptly when she appeared, knowing looks exchanged between courtiers who thought themselves unobserved. Her elevation had upset the careful balance of court politics, and she was beginning to understand that she wasn't just learning to be queen, she was learning to survive in a different kind of battlefield. "The Duchess of Raven's Hollow is asking pointed questions about the succession laws," she overheard Chancellor Aldwyn saying to Kaelen as they passed through the corridor outside the library. "Specifically, whether a Lunar who cannot prove noble birth can legitimately inherit the crown if—" The conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed her approach, both men offering polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. But the damage was done. She had heard enough to understand that her presence threatened more than just social conventions. It threatened the very foundation of royal legitimacy. Her first formal dinner as Luna was a disaster that would be whispered about in court circles for months to come. The great dining hall gleamed with crystal and silver, filled with the kingdom's most important nobles, all of them curious to see the former slave who dared claim a crown. Rin had prepared for weeks, practicing with Elena and Lady Vesper, until she could navigate formal place settings and remember the proper forms of address. But preparation couldn't account for the weight of dozens of stares, the pressure of knowing that every gesture was being judged, analyzed, found wanting. She made it through the first 3 courses without major incident, though she caught several. Guests exchanging amused glances when she forgot to wait for the king to begin eating before starting her own meal. But disaster struck during the 4th course, when a particularly pompous duke made a casual reference to bloodlines and breeding that was clearly directed at her. The words hit her like a physical blow, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, listening to raiders discuss her value as moldable stock. Her hands shook, wine splashed across the pristine tablecloth, and in the silence that followed, every person in the room seemed to hold their breath. "I apologize," she whispered, starting to rise from her chair with the instinctive response of a servant who had spilled something precious. "Sit," Kaelen's voice cut across the silence with quiet authority. "You have nothing to apologize for." His dark eyes swept the table, and the Duke, who had made the offensive comment, suddenly found his own wine very interesting. But the damage was done. Rin could feel the judgment radiating from the assembled nobles like heat from a fire. This was their proof that she didn't belong, could never belong, no matter what titles were hung around her neck like jewelry on a scarecrow. Later that night, alone in her chambers, with only the communication crystal for company, she finally allowed herself to break down. "I can't do this," she told the glowing stone, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm not strong enough, not smart enough, not anything enough. He saved me from one kind of prison just to lock me in another." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Kaelen had given her choices she had never dreamed possible, had treated her with kindness that still felt miraculous after so many years of cruelty. The prison she felt trapped in now wasn't made of iron chains, but of her own fears and limitations. Tessisa crystal pulsed with understanding warmth, and gradually Rin felt her breathing steady. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to fail or succeed. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at the palace, she made a conscious decision. She would not surrender. She had survived 16 years of deliberate breaking. She could survive the growing pains of learning to stand tall. The nobles who looked down on her had never been chained in the rain or beaten for showing kindness to a child. Let them judge her table manners while she learned to wield power they had never earned. The girl who whispered to crystals in the dark was beginning to find her voice. And when she did, the palace would discover that former slaves made dangerous queens precisely because they understood the true cost of freedom. The ancient wolf blade arrived with her breakfast tray, delivered without fanfare by Eleanor as if ceremonial. Weapons were commonly served alongside morning tea. The dagger was beautiful in its simplicity, silver steel that seemed to glow with inner light, wrapped in leather that had been worn smooth by generations of royal hands. Every lunar queen has. "Who carried this blade?" Elena explained, her voice hushed with reverence. "It represents your right to defend yourself and your position. His Majesty thought it was time." Rin lifted the weapon with trembling fingers, surprised by its perfect balance. The blade sang softly as she drew it from its sheath, and she felt something awaken in her chest. Not fear this time, but a fierce recognition. This was hers by right now, not by theft or accident, but by the ancient laws that governed their people. "I don't know how to use it," she admitted. "That's what lessons are for." Elena smiled. "Master Donovan is expecting you in the training yard after your morning studies." The training yard occupied a stone courtyard behind the main palace, surrounded by high walls that provided privacy from curious eyes. Here, away from the formal scrutiny of court life, Rin found she could move more freely. Master Donovan, a grizzled veteran with scars mapping old battles across his arms, treated her differently than he would any other student. "Forget you're a queen," he told her bluntly during their first session. "Forget you're anything but someone learning to stay alive. A blade doesn't care about your bloodline. It only cares whether you know how to use it." The physical training was brutal but liberating. For hours each day, she could focus on nothing but movement balance and the clean simplicity of steel against steel. Her muscles, soft from years of servant's work, began to strengthen and remember the potential that had been beaten out of them. "You have good instincts," Master Donovan observed after several weeks of training. "Someone taught you to fight before you came here." "No one taught me," Rin panted, lowering her practice blade. "I just learned to survive." "Same thing, really," he said with approval. "Survival instincts are better than formal training any day. We just need to refine them." But the real education came during the quiet hours she spent with Kaelen, when palace business permitted them stolen moments together. They would walk in the gardens or sit by the fire in his private study, and gradually, carefully, they began to know each other beyond their dramatic first meeting. "I never wanted the crown," he told her one evening as they watched the sun set over the capital's gleaming spires. My brother was supposed to be king. He had the gift for it, the charm, the political instincts, the ability to make hard decisions. Look easy. What happened to him? Rin asked softly. Border war with the eastern clans, a skirmish that should have been routine. Kaelen's jaw tightened with old grief. He took an arrow meant for a common soldier, died protecting someone else's son, while his own kingdom lost its future king. She studied his profile in the dying light, seeing the weight he carried. You blame yourself. I was his general. It was my job to keep him safe. He turned to meet her eyes. Just like it's my job to keep you safe now. I'm not your responsibility to protect, she said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. Aren't you? His voice was gentle, but there was steel underneath. I'm the one who brought you here, thrust you into a world you never asked for. If that doesn't make you my responsibility, what does? The question hung between them like a challenge. Rin wanted to argue, to insist on her independence, but the truth was more complicated. She was his responsibility, in ways both legal and emotional. But she was also beginning to understand that he was hers as well. This lonely man who wore a crown like armor and carried the weight of a kingdom's expectations. Their first major test came during a formal court session, where nobles from across the realm gathered to present petitions and grievances to the crown. Rin sat beside Kaelen on the paired thrones that had been used for centuries, trying to look queenly while feeling like an imposter wrapped in silk. The petitioners were a mix of genuine supplicants and political players, each one carefully studied by the royal advisors beforehand. Most treated her with the careful courtesy due to a queen, but she could sense the underlying skepticism in their manner. She was a curiosity to be examined, not a ruler to be respected. Then Duke Matthias of Ironhold stepped forward. He was a man in his 50s, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of natural authority that came from generations of noble breeding. His lands were among the richest in the kingdom, his political connections deep and carefully cultivated. When he spoke, other nobles listened. Your Majesty, he began, addressing Kaelen with perfect courtesy before turning cold eyes toward Rin. I come before you today concerned about certain irregularities in the succession laws, specifically whether our ancient customs regarding royal bloodlines are being properly observed. The throne room fell silent. Every person present understood that this was not a casual question, but a direct challenge to Rin's legitimacy. Duke Matthias was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push without openly committing treason. Our customs are clear, Kaelen replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The king chooses his Luna according to the wisdom of the crown and the guidance of fate. No other qualification is required. Of course, Your Majesty, Duke Matthias said with a smile that never reached his eyes. But surely the stability of the realm requires traditional approaches to such momentous decisions. The people have certain expectations regarding their queen. It was smoothly done, a challenge wrapped in concern, treason disguised as loyalty. But Rin had learned to recognize predators during her years with the Blackthorns, and she could see the calculation behind Duke Matthias's polite words. The people expect their queen to serve them faithfully, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the throne room. They expect her to understand their struggles and work for their welfare. I believe I am uniquely qualified to meet those expectations. A murmur ran through the assembled nobles, surprised perhaps that the former slave had found her voice at such a crucial moment. Duke Matthias's smile flickered slightly, but he wasn't finished. Indeed, Your Majesty, he said, the pause before her title, subtle but unmistakable. Though one might argue that understanding common struggles and possessing the wisdom to govern are different qualities entirely. The insult was delicately delivered but unmistakable. He was questioning not just her birthright, but her intelligence, her capability, her worthiness to sit on the throne beside their king. And in that moment, something shifted in Rin's chest. Not fear or hurt, but anger as clean and bright as the blade she now carried. You speak of wisdom, she said, rising from her throne with fluid grace. Tell me, Duke Matthias, what wisdom is required to understand that a kingdom's strength comes from the welfare of all its people, not just its nobles? His eyes narrowed slightly. I'm sure I don't follow your meaning. I think you do. Rin descended the steps toward him, and she could feel the attention of everyone in the room focusing like sunlight through crystal. I've seen what happens when nobles forget that their wealth depends on common labor. I've lived the consequences of that particular form of traditional wisdom. She was gambling everything on this moment, challenging one of the most powerful men in the kingdom based on nothing but her own hard-won understanding of injustice. But as she spoke, she could see uncertainty creeping into Duke Matthias's calculated composure. Your Majesty raises interesting points, he said carefully, clearly recognizing that the conversation had moved into dangerous territory for him. I raise necessary points, Rin corrected, because a queen who has never known hunger cannot truly understand the cost of bread. A queen who has never felt powerless cannot appreciate the weight of justice. Perhaps those are the qualifications your people truly need. The throne room buzzed with whispered conversations, nobles leaning together to share shocked observations. This was not the meek former slave they had expected. This was a woman who could match words with one of the realm's most skilled political players. Duke Matthias bowed with perfect form, but his eyes promised that this was far from over. Your Majesty speaks with passion. I look forward to seeing how such perspectives serve the crown. As he withdrew, Rin felt Kaelen's presence beside her like warmth from a fire. He had said nothing during the exchange, allowing her to fight her own battle, but she could sense his pride and approval. Well spoken, he murmured for her ears alone as they returned to their thrones. But even as she felt the flush of victory, Rin understood that she had just made her first real enemy at court. Duke Matthias would not forgive being challenged by someone he considered beneath his notice. The game of politics had begun in earnest, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. The moon pendant came to her in a dream, or so it seemed at first. Rin woke from restless sleep to find the silver chain around her neck, its crescent-shaped stone warm against her skin. The pendant pulsed with soft light in rhythm with her heartbeat, and she knew instinctively that this was no ordinary jewelry. It chooses its own time to appear, Kaelen explained, when she sought him out the next morning, still wearing her nightgown and robe in her urgency. My grandmother told me stories about it when I was young. The moon pendant reveals itself only to lunar queens who possess the old magic. Magic, Rin laughed, but the sound was shaky. I'm nobody special, I'm just— You're my Luna, he interrupted gently, and apparently you're more than either of us realized. The pendant's appearance coincided with other strange occurrences that Rin had been trying to ignore. Flowers bloomed out of season in the palace gardens after she walked through them. Sick servants recovered more quickly when she spent time in their presence. And twice now she had known things she couldn't possibly know. Once that a kitchen maid was pregnant before the girl had realized it herself, and once that a storm was coming hours before the clouds appeared. The royal bloodline carries certain gifts, Elena explained when Rin finally worked up the courage to ask. Not everyone inherits them, and they often skip generations. But when they do manifest, it usually happens during times of great emotional stress. Like being dragged from slavery to queenhood overnight, Rin said dryly, exactly like that. The magic was subtle, nothing like the dramatic displays in bardic tales. It was more an enhanced awareness, a deeper connection to the natural rhythms that governed life. When she focused, Rin could sense the emotional undercurrents in a room, could tell when someone was lying or hiding pain. The ability would have been useful during her years as a servant, but perhaps that was why it had remained hidden. Some gifts only revealed themselves when there was finally space for them to grow. Her growing confidence was tested when she began inserting herself more actively into palace business. She attended council meetings as an observer, her presence initially tolerated as a courtesy to the king. But as weeks passed, she began asking questions that cut to the heart of complex issues. The grain shortage in the eastern provinces, she said during one session, her voice cutting through a debate about tax policy. Has anyone considered that part of the problem might be nobles hoarding grain to drive up prices rather than a genuine crop failure? Chancellor Aldwyn looked at her with barely concealed condescension. Your Majesty, the economics of agricultural production are quite complex. Are they? She interrupted, something in her tone making the old man pause. Because it seems fairly simple to me. People are hungry, grain exists, but somehow it's not getting to market. In my experience, when basic necessities become scarce while the rich get richer, it's usually not an accident. Your experience, Duke Matthias said from his seat at the council table, his voice dripping with false courtesy, while no doubt incolourful, may not provide the full context needed for governance. My experience, Rin replied evenly, includes watching children starve while their lords feasted. If that's not relevant context for governance, then perhaps we have different ideas about what governing actually means. The tension in the council chamber was thick enough to cut with a knife. These men weren't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone they viewed as an upstart commoner playing at nobility. But Rin had learned something important during her confrontation with Duke Matthias. Her outsider perspective could be a weapon as sharp as any blade. Kaelen, seated at the head of the table, allowed the silence to stretch before speaking. Investigate the grain situation, he told his advisors, all aspects of it. The meeting ended with polite bows and careful courtesy, but Rin could feel the undercurrents of resentment. She was making enemies with every word she spoke, but she was also beginning to carve out her own space in the palace's complex political ecosystem. That evening, as she practiced swordwork with Master Donovan, she found herself moving with new fluidity. The pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with each strike, and she realized she was anticipating her opponent's moves almost before he made them. Interesting, the old weapons master said, lowering his practice blade. You're fighting like someone with battlefield experience now. Where did that come from? I don't know, she admitted. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if the magic awakening in her blood was older and deeper than anyone suspected. Her internal conflict reached a crescendo during a private dinner with Kaelen, when she, finally, voiced the fears that had been building since her arrival at the palace. I'm changing, she told him as they sat beside the fire in his private chambers. Every day I can feel myself becoming someone different, someone harder. Change isn't always a bad thing, he said carefully. Isn't it? She set down her wine glass with enough force to make the crystal ring. I used to be grateful for small kindnesses. Now I demand what I deserve as a right. I used to keep my opinions to myself. Now I challenge dukes in open court. What happens when I change so much that I'm no longer the person you thought you were saving? The question hung between them like a sword blade, sharp with implications. Kaelen was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. The person I found chained in that courtyard was strong enough to survive 16 years of systematic breaking without losing the fire in her eyes, he said finally. I didn't fall in love with a victim, Rin. I fell in love with a survivor, and survivors adapt. The words hit her like a physical blow. You love me? She whispered. Did you think I claimed you as Luna for political convenience? His laugh was rough with emotion. I had my pick of suitable noble daughters. I could have married for alliance or advantage or simple compatibility. Instead, I chose the woman who looked at me from a muddy courtyard and made me remember what it felt like to want to be worthy of someone's respect. I was nobody, she protested. I am nobody. You're everything. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his thumb tracing the faded scars on her wrist. Your courage and compassion and strength that's been tested in ways these court peacocks can't imagine. You're the reminder I needed that power exists to serve people, not the other way around. The declaration should have been romantic, but it terrified her instead. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of loss so devastating she wasn't sure she could survive it. She had learned to live without hope, but learning to live with it was proving infinitely more difficult. "What if I disappoint you?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if I disappoint you?" he countered. "What if the crown I wear proves too heavy for the man beneath it? What if the kingdom I'm trying to build crumbles because I lack my brother's natural gifts for leadership?" She looked at him then, really, looked and saw past the royal bearing to the uncertainty underneath. He was as afraid as she was, as unsure of his own worthiness. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. If even kings doubted themselves, how could someone like her ever feel secure? "We're quite a pair," she said finally, a rueful smile tugging at her lips. "We're exactly what we need to be," he replied, and in the warmth of his voice, she almost believed him. But that night, as she lay in her royal bed with the moon pendant warm against her throat, she couldn't shake the feeling that their happiness was borrowed time. The magic awakening in her blood whispered warnings she didn't yet understand, and somewhere in the palace's shadowed corners, she sensed the stirring of forces that would test everything they were trying to build. Change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. The only question was whether she would rise to meet it or be consumed by it. The assassination attempt came at dawn, when the palace slept, and the guards changed shifts. Rin woke to the sound of steel singing through air, her new magical awareness screaming danger a heartbeat before the blade would have found her throat. She rolled aside just as the dagger bit deep into her pillow, goose feathers exploding in a cloud of white. Her attacker was dressed in palace livery, but something about his movement pattern struck her as wrong. This wasn't a servant driven to desperate action. This was a trained killer wearing a disguise. Rin's hand found the ancient wolf blade on her nightstand, and she came up in a fighting crouch that would have made Master Donovan proud. "Who sent you?" she demanded, the ceremonial weapon steady in her grip despite the trembling in her legs. The assassin didn't answer, just lunged again with deadly precision. But Rin's enhanced awareness let her see the attack coming, and her blade met his with a ring of steel that seemed to echo through the chamber. They fought in deadly silence, neither wanting to alert the guards until one of them was dead. The assassin was skilled, but Rin fought with the desperate fury of someone who had already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. When her blade finally found his heart, he looked surprised that a former slave had bested him. With his dying breath, he whispered words that chilled her blood. "Silver moon rises." She was still standing over the body, blood on her hands and questions spinning in her mind, when Kaelen burst through the door with a squad of guards. His face went white when he saw the scene, and she realized how it must look, her in a blood-stained nightgown, holding a weapon over a dead man. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crossing to her in 3 quick strides. "No, but he said something before he died. Something about silver moon rising." She looked up at him, searching his face for recognition. "What does that mean?" Kaelen's expression changed, shifting from relief to something that looked almost like fear. "It means we need to search his body very carefully," he said grimly. "And then we need to have a conversation that's 16 years overdue." The search revealed more than just the tools of assassination. Hidden in the would-be killer's clothes was a brooch bearing the crest of House Blackthorn, a stylized thorn brush wrapped around a silver moon. But more disturbing was what they found stitched into the lining of his vest, documents that made Rin's blood run cold. "Birth records," Chancellor Aldwyn said, his voice hushed with shock as he studied the papers by candlelight in Kaelen's private study. "Marriage certificates, land grants, and a death certificate for the entire Silver Moon family, dated 3 days after you were taken from your village." Rin stared at the documents spread across Kaelin's desk, her mind struggling to process their implications. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "What do these have to do with me?" "Everything," Kaelen said softly, his dark eyes full of a pain she didn't yet comprehend. "Rin, I don't think you're just a former slave. I think you're the lost heir to one of the most powerful noble houses in the kingdom." The words hit her like physical blows. "That's impossible. My parents were simple villagers. My father was a blacksmith. My mother took in sewing." "Your father was Lord Marcus Silvermoon," Chancellor Aldwyn interrupted, his finger tracing a line on one of the documents. "Your mother was Lady Eleanor Silvermoon, born Eleanor Starweaver, of House Starweaver. And you, according to these records, are Lady Rin Silvermoon, heir to lands that span 3 provinces and command wealth that rivals the royal treasury itself." The revelation was too enormous to absorb. Rin sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. "No," she whispered. "No, you're wrong. I would know. I would remember." "You were 8 years old," Kaelen said gently, kneeling beside her chair. "Young enough that memories could be adjusted. Young enough to be convinced you were someone else entirely." "But why?" The question tore from her throat like a sob. Why would anyone do such a thing? The answer came in the form of more documents, these ones bearing the seal of House Blackthorn, land transfers dated the day after her parents' supposed death. Mining rights that had belonged to the Silvermoon family for generations, signed over to Lord Aldrich Blackthorn. Trade agreements that shifted enormous wealth from one house to another. "Murder," Kaelen said, the word falling like a stone into still water. "Your parents were murdered for their lands and holdings. You were supposed to die with them, but someone, Lord Blackthorn himself most likely, realized that a living heir could be useful. If you were kept as a slave, unaware of your true identity, then the Silvermoon lands would remain in Blackthorn hands indefinitely. And if she ever started asking questions," Chancellor Aldwyn added grimly, "or if anyone started investigating her disappearance, well, accidents happen to servants all the time." Rin felt the world tilting beneath her. Reality reshaping itself around truths too terrible to accept. The kind couple she remembered as her parents were noble lord and lady. The comfortable cottage of her childhood memories was actually a manor house worth a king's ransom. The raiders who destroyed her life were agents of the man who had spent 16 years systematically breaking her spirit. "The locket," she whispered, her hand flying to the silver chain around her neck. "The portrait inside is probably the only authentic thing they let you keep," Kaelen said. "A reminder of what you'd lost, disguised as a worthless trinket." She pulled the locket free with trembling fingers, opening it to study the tiny painted faces with new eyes. Her father's aristocratic features, her mother's elegant bearing, details she had overlooked as a child, but which now seemed obviously noble in bearing and dress. "I'm not who I thought I was," she said, the words coming out flat and emotionless as shock set in. "You're exactly who you've always been," Kaelen said firmly. "You're the woman who survived 16 years of deliberate torture without losing her compassion. You're the queen who stands up for servants' rights because you know what servants suffer. Your bloodline doesn't change that, it just explains why you were targeted in the first place." But Rin was barely hearing him. Her mind was spinning with implications, with the weight of stolen years and murdered parents, and a fortune built on her family's blood. The Blackthorn family crest seemed to burn in her vision. She had worn their livery, served at their table, knelt in the mud while they grew rich on her inheritance. "Duke Matthias," she said suddenly, looking up at Kaelen with eyes that blazed with new understanding. "He knew, didn't he? That's why he's been challenging my legitimacy so carefully. He knows I'm not just some common-born slave elevated by royal whim." "If he's involved in the original conspiracy, then yes," Kaelen agreed. "He would know exactly who you are and what your restoration would mean for the power structure of the entire kingdom." The political implications were staggering. If Rin reclaimed her birthright, she would control lands and resources that could challenge the royal treasury itself. She would go from being a controversial queen to being one of the most powerful nobles in the realm in her own right. How many people knew? She asked, her voice growing stronger as anger began to burn through the shock. How many people watched me scrub floors and haul water while knowing I was the rightful heir to one of the great houses? We're going to find out, Kaelen promised, and there was something in his tone that reminded her why he had been his brother's general before becoming king. Every single person involved in this conspiracy is going to answer for what they did to you and your family. But even as he spoke the words of comfort and justice, Rin was thinking beyond revenge. She was thinking about responsibility, about the weight of a name she had never known was hers, about the duties that came with noble blood and inherited power. She had spent months learning to be a queen. Now she would have to learn to be something even more challenging. Herself. The real herself, the woman she had always been beneath the scars and fears and carefully constructed survival mechanisms. Lady Rin Silvermoon, heir to a murdered house, rightful owner of stolen lands, and Lunar Queen of a realm that was about to discover just how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone who had nothing left to lose. The game was about to change, and this time she would be playing by her own rules. The Silvermoon battle standard hung in the deepest archives of Castle Lunaris, forgotten among hundreds of other artifacts from fallen houses. But when the royal historian brought it forth, at Kaelen's request, the ancient silk seemed to shimmer with renewed life. The silver moon embroidered on midnight blue fabric caught the torchlight and held it, as if the banner itself remembered its proud heritage. "It's been waiting for you," Elena said softly, as Rin traced the intricate needlework with reverent fingers. "Waiting for someone worthy to carry it again." The weeks following the revelation of her true identity had passed in a blur of preparation and discovery. Every day brought new evidence of the conspiracy that had stolen her life. Documents hidden in private collections, testimonies from servants who had been threatened into silence, financial records that traced the flow of Silvermoon wealth into Blackthorn coffers. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Lady Catherine, the Queen Dowager's former attendant, who had been so coldly disapproving of Rin's elevation. She appeared in Kaelen's study one morning, pale and trembling, with a confession that changed everything. "I knew," she said without preamble, her aristocratic composure cracking like ice in spring. "I knew who she was from the moment I saw her. She has her mother's eyes, her father's stubborn chin. I was Lady Eleanor's companion before her marriage. I helped arrange the flowers at her wedding." Kaelen's voice was dangerously quiet. "You knew, and you said nothing." "Lord Blackthorn approached me years ago," Lady Catherine continued, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to confess. "He said the girl was dead, that claiming otherwise would be treason against the crown. He said if I ever spoke of it, my own family would pay the price. I thought she really was dead. When she appeared here as your Luna, I didn't know what to believe." "You believed your own comfort was more important than justice," Rin said, her voice carrying the steel she had learned to wield in council chambers. "Yes," Lady Catherine whispered, "and I've lived with that shame every day since. I'm telling you now because I can't bear it any longer. The guilt is eating me alive." Her testimony provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Lord Blackthorn hadn't acted alone. He had co-conspirators among the nobility, people who had benefited from the redistribution of Silvermoon wealth, or who simply wanted to prevent the rise of a potentially powerful rival house. Duke Matthias was deeply involved, as were two other minor lords and at least 3 wealthy merchants who had profited from access to Silvermoon trade routes. "It's a web," Chancellor Aldwyn observed as they mapped the conspiracy's extent across Kaelen's war table. "Pull one thread and the whole thing unravels. But that also means they're all invested in keeping you silent, Your Majesty. Dead, preferably. The Formal challenge had to be presented according to ancient law. As the rightful heir to House Silvermoon, Rin could demand trial by combat and testimony to reclaim her inheritance. It was a legal mechanism that hadn't been used in over a century. But the laws remained on the books, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to invoke them. "They'll try to kill you before the trial," Master Donovan said bluntly during one of their extended training sessions. "Assassination, poison, arranged accidents, anything to prevent you from speaking in open court." "Let them try," Rin replied, her blade work flowing with the enhanced grace that came from her awakened magical abilities. "I've been dying by inches for 16 years. At least now I get to choose how to fight back." The weapons master smiled grimly. "There's the warrior. They've been training. You're not that frightened girl in chains anymore." He was right. The scared servant who had arrived at the palace months ago was gone, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. Rin could feel the transformation in her bones, in the way she moved through the world with purpose instead of apology. The moon, pendant at her throat, pulsed with warm energy, and she had learned to trust its warnings of danger or deception. Kaelen watched her changes with a mixture of pride and concern. During their private moments together, she could see him studying her face, as if trying to memorize features that were shifting away from the vulnerable woman he had rescued. "Are you afraid of who I'm becoming?" she asked him one evening as they stood on the castle's highest balcony, looking out over the capital's twinkling lights. "I'm afraid of losing you," he admitted. "Not to death, though that terrifies me too, but to the responsibilities that come with your birthright. A woman who controls half the kingdom's wealth doesn't need to be anyone's Luna." The fear in his voice surprised her. For all his royal authority and battle-tested confidence, Kaelen was still vulnerable to the same insecurities that plagued everyone who had ever loved someone they weren't sure they deserved. "You think I'll leave you once I have my own power?" she asked. "I think you'll have choices you never had before, and I'm not sure I can compete with the freedom that comes from complete independence." She turned from the view to study his profile in the moonlight, this complicated man who had saved her life and then worried that his salvation wasn't enough to hold her. "The freedom I want most," she said softly, "is the freedom to choose you. Not because I'm grateful or dependent or have nowhere else to go, but because you're the person I want to build a life with." "Even if that life includes war?" he asked. "Because that's what this trial will bring. The nobles involved in the conspiracy won't surrender quietly. They'll fight to protect what they've stolen. Then we fight back," she said simply. "I've spent too many years being afraid of powerful people who hurt others for profit. I'm done running from that fight." The trial preparations consumed every waking hour. Legal scholars pored over ancient precedents, while Kaelen's spies gathered intelligence on their enemies' likely strategies. Rin herself worked with a new tutor, Master Aldrich, an expert in noble genealogy who could trace bloodlines back to the kingdom's founding. "Your family's history is written in glory and tragedy," he told her, as they studied charts and documents that mapped centuries of Silvermoon achievements. They were warriors and diplomats, builders and protectors. The blood that flows in your veins has defended this realm for 600 years. The weight of that heritage was both inspiring and terrifying. She wasn't just fighting for personal justice anymore. She was fighting to restore a house that had served the crown with honor. For generations, a house that had been murdered for its loyalty and strength. Allies emerged from unexpected quarters as word of the upcoming trial spread through the nobility. Lords who had been neutral in court politics suddenly found reasons to support her cause, whether from genuine outrage at the injustice or simple recognition of which way the winds were blowing. Servants throughout the palace began treating her with new respect that went beyond mere protocol. They recognized her as someone who understood their struggles and would fight for their rights. But the most important support came from someone she had never expected, the Queen Dowager herself. Kaelen's mother, who had been traveling in the eastern provinces for months. Queen Mother Lyanna arrived with an escort that looked more like a small army, her silver hair gleaming beneath a circlet that had been her grandmother's. She was a woman who commanded respect through pure force of personality, and when she swept into the throne room for her first audience with Rin, the air itself seemed to crackle with power. "So you're the girl who's turned my son's world upside down," she said, studying Rin with eyes that missed nothing. "I've heard remarkable things about you, and some rather disturbing things about the circumstances of your elevation, Your Majesty." Rin began, but the Queen Dowager waved her silent. "I knew your mother," Lyanna said without preamble. "Elena Starweaver was my dearest friend before she married your father. I was at your christening, child. I held you when you were barely a week old, and you wrapped your tiny fingers around mine with a grip that spoke of determination even then." The revelation hit Rin like a physical blow. Another person who had known, another connection to the life that had been stolen from her. But unlike Lady Catherine, there was no guilt in Queen Lyanna's manner, only grief and carefully controlled rage. "I thought you were dead," the Queen Mother continued, her voice tight with old pain. "We all did. When the reports came of the raid, of the entire family killed, I mourned for you as I would have mourned my own grandchild. To learn that you lived all these years in chains while I grieved for a ghost, it changes everything." "What do you mean?" Rin asked. "I mean that justice delayed is still justice," Lyanna said firmly. "And I mean that when you reclaim your birthright, you'll have the full support of the Crown Dowager. Anyone who harmed the Silver Moon line harmed me personally." The alliance was more valuable than Rin had dared to hope. Queen Lyanna commanded loyalty among the older, noble families, and her endorsement would legitimize Rin's claims in ways that even Kaelen's support couldn't match. But it also escalated the stakes of the coming trial to dangerous new levels. "They'll move against us soon," Kaelen said that evening, as they reviewed their preparations one final time. "The formal challenge goes before the court tomorrow. After that, there's no turning back." "There was no turning back the moment you found me chained in that courtyard," Rin replied. "Everything that's happened since has just been the consequences of that first moment of justice." The war room had been transformed into a command center, with maps and documents covering every surface. Their allies' positions were marked in blue, their enemies in red, and the uncommitted nobles in yellow. The pattern that emerged was both encouraging and sobering. They had significant support, but their opponents controlled crucial resources and had years of careful preparation. On their side, Duke Matthias will challenge the evidence, Chancellor Aldwyn predicted, his finger tracing likely attack vectors on their battle plan. He'll claim forgery, coercion, anything to discredit the documents we've gathered, and he'll have expert witnesses to support his claims. "Then we'll have better experts," Rin said simply, "and we'll have the truth." "Truth doesn't always win in court," Master Aldrich warned, "especially when facing opponents who have spent years preparing their lies." "Maybe not," Rin agreed, "but it's all we have, and it's more than they expect us to have. They built their conspiracy on the assumption that I would never remember who I was, never find the strength to fight back. That was their mistake." Night before the trial, Rin stood alone in the chapel that had served the royal family for generations. The ancient stones seemed to whisper with the prayers of countless kings and queens who had sought divine guidance in their darkest hours. She wasn't sure she believed in the old gods, but she found comfort in the continuity they represented. "Scared?" Kaelen's voice came from behind her, soft in the sacred space. "Terrified," she admitted without turning around, "but not of dying. I'm terrified of failing, of letting everyone down who's counting on me to get this right. You won't." "Fail," he said with quiet certainty, moving to stand beside her before the altar. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, and you're fighting for something pure. Justice for your family, safety for the innocent, a kingdom where power serves the people instead of the other way around." "What if strength isn't enough?" she asked. "Then we'll find out together," he replied, taking her hand in his. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever comes after, we face it as partners, as equals." The words were a promise and a recognition rolled into one. He wasn't just offering support, he was acknowledging that she had grown beyond needing his protection, had become someone who could stand beside him as an equal rather than behind him as a dependent. "I'd love you," she said, the words coming easier now than they had months ago. "Not for what you've given me, but for who you are. For the man who sees injustice and acts to stop it, even when it's inconvenient or dangerous." "I love you too," he replied. "The woman who survived the worst humanity has to offer and still fights to protect others from the same fate. The queen who remembers what it feels like to be powerless and uses her power to serve rather than control." They stood together in the candlelit silence, drawing strength from each other for the battle ahead. Tomorrow would bring accusations and denials, legal maneuvering and political theater. But tonight, they were just two people who had found each other against impossible odds and refused to let go. The Silver Moon battle standard waited in her chambers, ready to be carried into court as a symbol of her restored heritage. The ancient Wolfblade rested at her side, a reminder of her right to defend herself and others. The moon pendant pulsed warm against her throat, awakened magic singing in harmony with her determination. She was ready. After 16 years of waiting without knowing what she was waiting for, after months of preparation and revelation and transformation, she was finally ready to reclaim not just her birthright, but her identity. Tomorrow, the kingdom would learn what happened when the powerless found their power, when the silenced found their voice, when the dead rose to demand justice for their own murder. Tomorrow, Lady Rin Silvermoon would take back everything that had been stolen from her family's name. The Great Hall of Justice had not seen such a gathering in living memory. Every seat was filled, every balcony packed with nobles who had traveled from across the realm to witness what the court historians were already calling the trial of the century. The ancient judgment stone sat at the center of the hall, its crystalline surface dark and waiting. Rin entered carrying the Silver Moon battle standard herself, the midnight blue silk flowing behind her like a river of starlight. She had chosen her clothes carefully, not the elaborate gowns of court fashion, but the simple elegance that befitted a noble house with 6 centuries of honorable service. The ancient wolf blade hung at her side, and the moon pendant gleamed. At her throat, the murmur of conversation died as she walked the length of the hall. Every eye followed her progress, and she could feel the weight of their attention like a physical force. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism, and more than a few displayed barely concealed hostility. But she kept her gaze fixed on the raised dais where Kaelen sat in judgment, flanked by the kingdom's most senior legal scholars. Lord Blackthorn was already present, flanked by his own legal counsel and looking every inch the offended nobleman forced to endure baseless accusations. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his expensive robes immaculate, and his expression carried just the right mixture of confusion and indignation. Lady Miriam sat beside him, her beauty unmarred by the years, but her eyes cold as winter ice. Duke Matthias occupied a place of honor among the assembled nobles, his presence lending credibility to the Blackthorn cause. He nodded gravely to Rin as she passed, the gesture carrying mock respect that barely concealed his certainty of victory. "The court will come to order," Chancellor Aldwyn announced, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "We are gathered, here to hear the claim of Lady Rin, Lunar Queen of this realm, that she is the rightful heir to House Silvermoon, wrongfully dispossessed through murder and conspiracy." The formal words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. This was it, the moment when accusation became official, when whispers and rumors transformed into legal proceedings that would reshape the kingdom's power structure. "Your Majesty," Rin said, her voice steady despite the enormity of the moment, I stand before this court to reclaim not just my birthright, but justice for my murdered parents and vindication for all who have suffered under the conspiracy that stole my life." "The court recognizes your claim," Kaelen replied, with the formal neutrality required of his position. "Present your evidence." Master Aldrich stepped forward, his arms full of documents that represented months of careful investigation. But before he could speak, Lord Blackthorn's lead counsel, a sharp-faced man named Master Corwin, rose to object. "Your Majesty, we respectfully challenge the very foundation of these proceedings," he said smoothly. "The woman making these claims was found as a common servant in my client's household. She has lived as such for 16 years. To suggest that she is somehow the lost heir to a great noble house stretches credibility beyond reason." "The evidence will speak for itself," Master Aldrich replied calmly, "beginning with birth records authenticated by 3 separate royal genealogists." He spread the documents across the evidence table, each one bearing official seals and signatures. The judgment stone remained dark, but Rin could feel something stirring in its crystalline depths, an awareness that truth and lies were about to be tested before its ancient power. Birth certificate for Lady Rin Silvermoon, born in the 15th year of King Aldwin III's reign, to Lord Marcus Silvermoon and Lady Eleanor Silvermoon, née Starweaver. Baptismal records from the Chapel of Eternal Stars. Medical records from the royal physician who attended her birth. Each document was presented to the court, examined by neutral observers, and recorded by the official scribes. The weight of paperwork was impressive, but Rin knew that Lord Blackthorn's advocates would challenge every piece of evidence with questions about authenticity and forgery. "Furthermore," Master Aldrich continued, "we present testimony from Queen Mother Lyanna, who knew the child personally and can attest to her identity." A ripple of surprise ran through the assembled nobles. The Queen Dowager's involvement elevated the proceedings from noble squabble to royal concern, and her word carried weight that few would dare challenge directly. Queen Lyanna rose from her place of honor, her bearing regal even without crown or formal robes. "I knew Lady Elena Silvermoon from childhood," she said, her clear voice carrying easily through the hall. "I was present at this young woman's birth, held her as an infant, and can attest without reservation that she is exactly who she claims to be." "And yet," Master Corwin interjected smoothly, "Your Majesty believed the child dead for 16 years. Memory can play tricks, especially when we desperately want something to be true." The challenge was delicately phrased but unmistakable. He was suggesting that the Queen Mother's grief had clouded her judgment, that she was seeing what she wanted to see, rather than what was actually there. "My memory is quite clear," Queen Lyanna replied with dangerous quiet, "as is my recognition of the Starweaver family features that this young woman inherited from her mother. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the way she carries herself when she thinks no one is watching, these are not things that can be faked or coached." The judgment stone flickered slightly, a brief pulse of pale light that made several observers gasp. It was beginning to respond to the competing claims being made before it, though its full power would not manifest until all evidence was presented. "We also present financial evidence," Master Aldrich continued, apparently unruffled by the stone's reaction. "Land transfers and mining rights that passed from House Silvermoon to House Blackthorn immediately following the reported deaths of the family. Curiously, these transfers were signed and sealed before news of the tragedy could have reached the capital. This evidence struck home like an arrow finding its target." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles as they grasped the implication. Documents had been prepared in advance, suggesting foreknowledge of the family's deaths. Lord Blackthorn leaned forward in his seat, his careful composure slipping slightly. "Those documents were prepared as a contingency," he said, his voice carrying a note of strain. "House Silvermoon's holdings were valuable, and in times of border unrest, prudent men prepare for all possibilities, including the possibility of murdering an entire family. Rin asked, her voice cutting through the formal proceedings like a blade. The question hung in the air like an accusation made manifest. This wasn't the carefully neutral language of legal proceedings. This was personal, direct, and devastating in its simplicity. "I object to such inflammatory language," Master Corwin said quickly. "My client is not on trial for murder. He is here to defend against baseless claims regarding property that has been legally his for 16 years. Property that was stolen through the murder of its rightful owners," Rin replied, her eyes fixed on Lord Blackthorn's increasingly pale face. "Property that you knew belonged to me because you knew exactly who I was when you kept me as a slave in your household." The judgment stone pulsed again, brighter this time, and several people in the gallery shifted nervously. Ancient magic was stirring, responding to the weight of truth and deception in the great hall. "You have no proof of such wild accusations," Lord Blackthorn said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Don't I?" Rin smiled, and there was something in her expression that made him lean back in his chair. "Tell me, my lord, if I was truly just another servant child purchased from raiders, why did you keep me so close? Why assign me to duties that kept me in the main house rather than the fields or kitchens? Why did you and your wife watch me so carefully, as if you were waiting for something?" The questions came like hammer blows, each one precisely targeted at the weaknesses in his story. Lord Blackthorn's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, searching for answers that wouldn't further incriminate him. "You were waiting for me to remember," Rin continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You were watching for signs that my real identity might surface, ready to silence me permanently if it ever did. That's why you punished me so severely for the smallest infractions. You needed to keep me broken, keep me convinced I was nothing, because you knew that if I ever remembered who I really was, your entire conspiracy would unravel." The judgment stone blazed with sudden light, its crystalline surface catching fire with power that hadn't stirred in over a century. Truth was resonating through the ancient artifact, and its response was unmistakable to everyone present. In that moment of blazing revelation, Lord Blackthorn's careful composure finally cracked completely, and the truth came spilling out like blood from a mortal wound. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Lord Blackthorn's voice cracked like breaking glass. His careful facade finally shattered beyond repair. "The child was supposed to die with her parents, but when she survived, Duke Matthias said she could be useful, a living heir under our control was better than a dead one who might inspire questions." The confession exploded across the great hall, like lightning striking dry wood. Gasps echoed from the gallery, and several nobles half rose from their seats in shock. Duke Matthias went rigid, his face draining of color as he realized his co-conspirator had just implicated him in front of the entire assembled court. "Silence!" Master Corwin shouted at his client, but it was far too late. The dam had burst, and 16 years of carefully guarded secrets came pouring out. "You don't understand the pressure we were under," Lord Blackthorn continued, his voice rising with hysteria. "The Silvermoon lands contained the richest silver deposits in the kingdom. The trade routes alone were worth a fortune. If we hadn't acted, House Blackthorn would have been bankrupted by our debts within 5 years." The judgment stone blazed brighter with each confession, its light now so intense that it cast stark shadows across the hall. The ancient artifact was responding to truth spoken under duress, validating every word, even as it condemned the speaker. "So you murdered my parents for money," Rin said, her voice deadly quiet in contrast to Lord Blackthorn's shrieking confessions. "You killed them and stole everything they had built, everything they loved, everything they would have left to me. It was Duke Matthias's plan." Lord Blackthorn pointed a shaking finger at the Duke, who sat frozen in his seat like a man watching his own execution. "He arranged everything, the raiders, the false death certificates, the land transfers. I just did what he told me to do." Duke Matthias finally found his voice, though it came out strangled with rage and fear. "You fool," he hissed at Lord Blackthorne. "You've doomed us all." "No," Rin said, rising from her seat with fluid grace. "You doomed yourselves the moment you decided my family's lives were worth less than your greed." The restored silver moon seal blazed to life in her hand, a ring that had been hidden in the royal archives, waiting for the rightful heir to claim it. The ancient silver caught the judgment stone's light and threw it back in patterns that seemed to dance with their own life. "I am Lady Rin Silvermoon," she declared, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "Daughter of Lord Marcus and Lady Elena, rightful heir to the lands and titles stolen through murder and conspiracy. I stand before this court not as a victim seeking pity, but as a noble daughter demanding justice for crimes against my house and my family." The transformation was complete. Gone was any trace of the frightened servant girl who had cowered under the Blackthorn's cruelty. In her place stood a woman who radiated the authority of ancient bloodlines and hard-won wisdom, backed by magic that recognized truth and punished deception. "Furthermore," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the assembled nobles, "I call for the immediate arrest of Duke Matthias, Lord Aldrich Blackthorne, and Lady Miriam Blackthorne on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, theft of noble lands, and treason against the crown." Duke Matthias finally found his courage, or perhaps his desperation drove him to one last gamble. He rose from his seat, his hand moving toward the ceremonial sword at his side. "I will not be condemned by some upstart slave who deludes herself with fantasies of nobility," he snarled. "This entire proceeding is a farce designed to legitimize the king's shocking choice of consort." But even as he spoke, royal guards were moving to surround him. Kaelen had anticipated this moment, had prepared for the possibility that the accused would resort to violence when legal options failed. "Stand down, Duke Matthias," Kaelen commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You are under arrest, by order of the crown. Never!" The Duke's sword cleared its sheath in a ring of steel, and suddenly the great hall erupted into chaos. Several of his supporters moved to join him, while others scrambled to get clear of the violence. Steel sang against steel as guards moved to protect the royal family and restore order. But Rin was no longer someone who needed protection from others' violence. The ancient wolf blade appeared in her hand as if summoned by will alone, and she moved toward the Duke with the deadly grace Master Donovan had drilled into her through months of training. "You want to settle this with swords," she called to him across the chaos. "Then let's settle it properly. Single combat with the judgment. Stone as witness, your life against the truth of my claims." Duke Matthias turned toward her, his eyes wild with desperate fury. "You think 16 years of chains taught you to be a warrior? I'll cut you down like the pretender you are." They met in the center of the hall, their blades crossing in a shower of sparks that seemed to echo the judgment stone's blazing light. But where the Duke fought with the desperate savagery of a man with nothing left to lose, Rin fought with the cold precision of someone who had already survived the worst that life could offer. "This is for my father," she said as her blade turned aside his wild slash. "This is for my mother," she continued, her riposte opening a line of blood across his sword arm. "And this," she finished, her final thrust finding the gap in his guard, "is for every child who suffered because you thought power meant the right to destroy innocent lives." Duke Matthias fell to his knees, the sword dropping from nerveless fingers. The judgment stone's light reached its crescendo, blazing so brightly that it seemed to fill the entire hall with silver fire. And in that light, the truth was, finally, irrevocably revealed for all to see. The court recognizes Lady Rin Silvermoon as the rightful heir to her family's lands and titles, Kaelen declared, his voice carrying absolute finality. All properties stolen through the conspiracy are hereby restored to her control. All participants in the murder of Lord and Lady Silvermoon are sentenced to death for treason and murder. The great hall fell silent, except for the soft sobbing of Lady Miriam, who had finally understood that her world of privilege built on stolen blood was crumbling around her. Lord Blackthorne sat in stunned silence, his confession having sealed not just his fate, but his understanding of how completely he had underestimated the girl he thought he had broken. But Rin felt no triumph in their downfall, only the bitter satisfaction of justice finally served. Her parents were still dead, her childhood still stolen, her years of suffering still carved into her soul. Victory couldn't undo the past, but it could prevent others from suffering the same fate. "It's over?" Kaelen said softly, approaching her as the guards led the condemned away. "No," she replied, watching the judgment stone's light slowly fade back to quiescence. "It's just beginning. Now I have to figure out how to use the power I've reclaimed to build something better than what came before." The girl who had been chained in the rain was gone forever, but the woman who stood in her place was someone far more dangerous to those who preyed on the innocent. She had learned the true cost of powerlessness, and she would never forget the lessons written in scars across her heart. Lady Rin Silvermoon, Lunar Queen and restored heir, was ready to reshape a kingdom that had forgotten the difference between power and justice. And she would start by making sure that no child ever again suffered as she had suffered, lost as she had been lost, forgotten as her family had been forgotten. The reckoning was complete. Now came the harder task of building something worthy of the price that had been paid for it. The coronation took place on the first anniversary of Rin's rescue from the Blackthorne estate, a date chosen to mark not just her elevation, but her transformation from victim to queen. The great cathedral blazed with candlelight and silver banners, while nobles from across the realm gathered to witness the formal recognition of what many now saw as destiny fulfilled rather than scandal endured. The united crowns had been crafted by the kingdom's most skilled artisans, a masterwork that joined the ancient Lunar's circlet with elements of the restored Silvermoon crest. Moonstone and silver intertwined in patterns that spoke of unity between old power and new purpose, between royal authority and noble justice. "Do you swear to rule with wisdom and compassion?" the high priest intoned, his voice carrying through the vaulted spaces of the cathedral, "to protect the innocent and defend the realm against all who would harm it?" "I do so swear," Rin replied, her voice steady and strong. The words carried weight beyond mere ceremony. They were a promise to the girl she had been, to the parents she had lost, and to everyone who still suffered under the kind of system that had once held her in chains. The crown settled on her brow with surprising lightness, as if it had been made specifically for her, rather than crafted to accommodate the union of two ancient legacies. In that moment, she felt the presence of those who had come before, generations of queens who had worn similar crowns, and the parents she barely remembered, but whose love had somehow sustained her through 16 years of deliberate breaking. Kaelen stood beside her, his own crown gleaming in the candlelight, but she could see in his eyes that he understood what she had always known. They were partners now, equals in authority and responsibility. The scared girl who had needed his protection was gone, replaced by a woman who could stand at his side without diminishing either of them. The months following the trial had been a whirlwind of rebuilding and reform. The Silvermoon estates, neglected under Blackthorne's stewardship, required extensive restoration. But more importantly, Rin had used her newfound wealth and influence to begin systematic changes in how servants and common folk were treated throughout the realm. Her first royal decree had been simple but revolutionary. No person could be held in bondage for debt, and all servants must be paid fair wages for their labor. The law had been met with grumbling from some noble houses, but Rin's story had captured the common people's imagination. She was living proof that the powerless could rise, that justice could prevail even against seemingly impossible odds. "The kingdom is changing," Elena observed as they stood in the palace gardens, watching children from the servants' quarters play freely on grounds that had once been forbidden to them. You've given people hope they didn't know they were missing. I've given them what I never had, Rin replied, absently touching the moon pendant at her throat. The belief that their lives matter, that their dignity deserves protection. The magic in her blood had grown stronger since the trial, as if claiming her true identity had unlocked power that noble heritage alone could not provide. She could sense the emotional undercurrents in any gathering, could tell when someone was lying or in pain or harboring dangerous intentions. But more than that, she could inspire others to find their own strength, their own voices, their own courage to stand against injustice. The economic impact of her reforms had been surprisingly positive. When servants were paid fairly and treated with respect, they worked more efficiently and with greater loyalty. When common folk had legal protections, they invested more readily in their communities. The kingdom that emerged from her changes was stronger, not weaker, than what had come before. But the most profound transformation was in Rin herself. The woman who now walked through palace halls with quiet authority bore little resemblance to the broken girl who had arrived in chains of iron and fear. She had learned to wield power as naturally as she wielded the ancient wolf blade, with precision, purpose, and an understanding that strength existed to protect rather than dominate. "Any regrets?" Kaelen asked her one evening as they sat together, in their private chambers, watching the sunset paint the capital's spires in shades of gold and rose. "About which part?" she replied with a smile that held depths he was still discovering. "About discovering I was someone else entirely? About the trial that nearly got us all killed? About the responsibility of ruling half the kingdom in my own right? About any of it? About all of it?" She considered the question seriously, as she considered all things now. The frightened girl who gave quick, desperate answers to avoid punishment had grown into a woman who understood the weight that words could carry. "I regret the years that were stolen," she said finally. "I regret that my parents died for the crime of being in the way of someone else's greed. I regret that I didn't get to grow up knowing who I was, didn't get to learn their stories and carry their wisdom." "But," he prompted, sensing there was more. "But I don't regret the person those experiences made me," she continued. "I understand suffering in ways that someone raised in comfort never could. I know what it means to be powerless, so I can use power responsibly. I've learned that strength isn't the ability to hurt others. It's the ability to protect them, even when protection requires sacrifice." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Elena entered with a young girl in tow, perhaps 10 years old, with dark hair and eyes that held too much wariness for someone so young. "Your Majesty," Elena said with a slight curtsy, "this is Sarah. She was found in the same situation you once faced, in a household 2 provinces south. The local magistrate thought you might want to meet her personally." Rin knelt to bring herself to the child's eye level, recognizing the fear and confusion in the girl's posture. She had been there herself, had felt that same terrible uncertainty about whether rescue was real or just another form of torment. "Hello, Sarah," she said gently. "My name is Rin. I want you to know that you're safe now, and you're free. No one will ever hurt you again, and no one will ever make you feel like you don't matter." The girl stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for signs of deception or cruelty. Then, slowly, she nodded. "What happens to me now?" Sarah whispered. "Whatever you choose," Rin replied. "You can stay here at the palace if you like, or we can find you a good family to live with. You can learn to read and write, learn a trade, learn anything you want. The only thing you can't do is go back to being someone's property." From her pocket, Rin withdrew a simple silver ring, not valuable in terms of gold or gems, but priceless in its meaning. It was a symbol of the choice she offered to every child they rescued, every servant they freed, every person who had been told they were nothing. "This is yours if you want it," she said, holding out the ring. "It means you belong to yourself, that your life and your choices are your own. It means you're free." Sarah took the ring with trembling fingers, and Rin saw in her eyes the same awakening she had felt in that muddy courtyard when Kaelen first asked her name. Not just rescue from immediate danger, but the recognition of inherent worth, the understanding that she mattered as a person rather than as property. Later that night, after Sarah had been settled in comfortable quarters with promises of education and care, Rin stood at her bedroom window, watching the moon rise over the capital. The silver light fell across the city like a blessing, and she could imagine it reaching into every corner where people still suffered under systems designed to crush their spirits. "Thinking about the future?" Kaelen asked, joining her at the window. "Thinking about all the children like Sarah who are still out there," she replied. "All the people who haven't been rescued yet, who don't even know rescue is possible. This is just the beginning, isn't it?" "If you want it to be," he said, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "You've already done more to change this kingdom than most rulers manage in a lifetime. No one would fault you for resting on your achievements. Would you?" she asked, leaning back against his chest. "Would you be content to rule a kingdom that was only marginally better than what we inherited?" "No," he admitted with a chuckle. "Which is probably why we're well matched for this particular burden." The burden, she reflected, felt less heavy when shared with someone who understood its weight. Together, they could build something that honored the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. Not just her parents' deaths or her years of suffering, but the courage of everyone who had chosen to stand up against injustice despite the personal cost. In the distance, the cathedral bells began to chime midnight, marking not just the end of another day, but the beginning of whatever came next. Rin touched the united crowns where they rested on her dresser, feeling the subtle magic that flowed through the joined silver and stone. She was no longer the girl who had been chained in the rain, but she carried that girl's memories and pain as a reminder of why power existed. Not to elevate those who held it, but to protect those who needed it most. The crown on her head was beautiful, but it was also a responsibility that would last the rest of her life. And as the moonlight painted silver paths across the kingdom she now helped to rule, Rin smiled and prepared to meet that responsibility with the same determination that had carried her from chains to crown, from victim to victor, from forgotten slave to queen who would ensure that no one else was ever forgotten again.